What is up, y'all? Welcome back to another episode of the Two Game Podcast. So for the month of August, our Patreon supporters voted for me to do an episode of my top 10 games of all time. And I was sitting here kind of making my list. I wrote down a bunch of different games to kind of narrow it down to 10. And I thought to myself, hey, maybe this would be a good episode to kind of show how I'm going to work through my top 10 games and kind of narrow it down to the actual top 10 itself. Right, so I have a list of 10 games that we're going to talk about on this particular episode. And I have to narrow this down to 5 games. Now, these 5 games are going to be somewhere in my top 10. I am not including when I went through my list and I wrote down all the names of the games that I just absolutely love and that I think about on a consistent basis, I starred like the 5 that just immediately came to my mind and that were no-brainers for my top 10. Now, for these other 10 games, like I said, we're going to narrow this down to the 5 for the back half of my top 10. Now, I'm not going to mention what order they're in, so you can still be a little surprised when I go through my top 10 when I do my top 10 episode. So, first up, the 10 games that we're going to be talking about today. We have Dead Cells, Dark Souls, Spider-Man 2, Final Fantasy 16, Xenoblade Chronicles 2, Horizon Forbidden West, Batman Arkham City, Resident Evil Biohazard, Hollow Knight, and then Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. So we're going to start off with just one that I think is just automatically going to be taken off the board immediately, but I do want to discuss it. Resident Evil Biohazard. This was one of the first games, if not the first game, that I started playing when I really got back into video games, because I went several years without ever really playing anything else other than NCAA Football 14. So I had started working with Christian, and this was kind of my first chance back into video games. And Resident Evil Biohazard was my first Resident Evil game. And I absolutely loved this game. Loved it. I thought it was actually pretty scary. I thought it was a great horror game. And it was kind of a mixture between like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but also kind of like the Resident Evil series in general, but kind of putting a new spin on it. The one thing that I will say about this game, and it is what makes me want to just kick it off the list immediately. I don't know, it's probably not the last third of this game, but it's the back end of the game. And there's going to be spoilers for all these games that I've already mentioned. So if you haven't played any of these games and you want to, and you don't want to be spoiled, then you should click out of this episode. But the game took a drastic turn, not necessarily in quality, but it just lost its flavor to me when Ethan leaves the house and then goes to the, I think it is a radically different game at that point. And that's one of the issues, if not the biggest issue that I have with the entire game. It's like, I love the setting of being in that house and dealing with the family and so on and so forth. It was just absolutely fantastic. And as soon as you leave the house, it is just like you played a completely different game. So that is one of the reasons why I feel like I could knock this off my board. Now, I guess maybe it's going to be one of those things where Resident Evil, you always remember your first game. It's kind of like a Dark Souls game, your first Dark Souls game is always probably going to be your favorite. If not, maybe it's my favorite because of it being my first Resident Evil game. Although you can make the case that probably Resident Evil 2 Remake is, which I'm not discounting Resident Evil 2 Remake, but I think I do prefer Biohazard over that one just because it has more of what I want from Resident Evil. Just because it has more of what I want from a Resident Evil game, which is just pure horror and grotesque settings. So yeah, I feel confident in just go ahead and crossing off Resident Evil Biohazard on this list. Now, I'm going to be kind of going back and forth between sharing my screen and not. So yeah, we have Resident Evil Biohazard. So we have Resident Evil Biohazard crossed off the list as per now. I think the next game that I really want to talk about is Batman Arkham City. Now, I have played this game one time. I don't think about it on a regular basis. The thing about this game is I remember playing it and I just remember the story being so fucking good. So fucking good. And out of all the Batman Arkham games that I played, Arkham City was definitely my favorite. But it's also the one that I remember the least because it's been so long since I played that game. And the only thing that I truly remember that game is just how expansive Gotham was and how they went from Arkham Asylum to Arkham City. And it was just like, it was taking like a 10 leaps forward in terms of like how you make a great game. And I just remember the story being absolutely phenomenal. But that's legitimately all that I remember of it. So I feel like I should cross off Batman Arkham City just because it doesn't really have the staying power for me specifically. So I'm not saying it's a bad game. I'm just saying that I have a shitty memory, and for it to be in my top 10, I feel like it has to have, I feel like I have to know just about everything about this game and just be able to recall a majority of the events and stuff like that. And while I love Batman Arkham City, I don't think it's a top 10 game all time for me personally. All right, so the next game that I want to talk about is Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon. And I think this brings up a good conversation that what is one of your most memorable games versus is it actually a top 10 game for you? So Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon released right when I just had a brand new child. So I'm legitimately, I have the baby in my arms and I'm playing Ultra Sun, Ultra Moon. And I just remember putting so many freaking hours into this game. It was the best version of what Sun and Moon it is to me. I know I grew up on all the Pokemon games, especially Red and Blue when they first came out. And I to this day, I think Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon is my absolute favorite Pokemon game. It has everything that I want. It has a decent story. I think the one issue with Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon is the story, because they added some additional stuff to the story from the base game, and I think that actually made it worse. They added the extra dimensional travel, and you can go collect all of the legendaries from previous games, and it turned it into a mini game, which made it even better. And you never knew what you were going to get when you went through the portal, so it added some anxiety to it, and it was great. Like, I had an amazing time with Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, especially trying to complete the entire Pokedex and then build out my roster. It is just an amazing game, and I'll stand here and say that it is, to me, the best Pokemon game, period. But is it a top 10 game all time for me? I think it might be right outside my top 10. And again, that brings up the conversation of, is this one of my 10 best games? Or is it one of my 10 best experiences for a video game? Because I feel like those are two different categories that you could have. I don't think necessarily the best experience is going to be your favorite game of all time, because while as much as I love Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon, I really haven't gone back to it in years. And I also don't think about it. Only time I ever think about it is the only time that I really ever think about Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon is when a new Pokemon game gets released, or when I decide, hey, what are my top 10 games of all time? So in between that, I don't really give it a whole lot of extra thought. So I feel like, yes, one of the best gaming experiences that I've ever had, because it is tied to one of my children being born. But is it a top 10 game of all time? I don't think so. So I'm crossing Pokemon Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon off the list. And the next game that I want to talk about, and I think that is Spider-Man 2. Marvel Spider-Man 2 came out last year, and I 100% of the game, got the platinum. Love the story. I think the story is so damn good. Maybe not as good as the first one, but I think it might be maybe not as good as the first one, but it's more ambitious than the first one, I think, because you throw in the addition of Miles into this game, and then you can swap back and forth between those two characters. So overall, I think this is probably the better game than the OG Spider-Man game. But at the same time, I think the story was done a little bit better in that first Spider-Man game, just because it had a little bit more personality to it, just because it had a little bit more like emotional moments in that game versus this one. I'm not saying Spider-Man 2 doesn't have emotional moments, but I feel like they just hit a little bit better in that first game. Now, I do dig the teases for a Spider-Man 3 game, Carnage coming into the mix, probably a Green Goblin coming into the mix as well, probably being the two big villains of that game. So the teases are really great. Again, I'm not saying this is a bad game, but is it a top 10 game all time for me? And trying to sit back and looking at some of the other games that I have on this list, does it compete with those? And look, amazing combat, Amazing combat. I think some of the actual Spider-Man moments in this game are just pitch perfect. Like, it is what you would describe as like the character of Spider-Man. I vividly remember them having like two of the best side quests of all time. One of those being the one where he's in the park talking to the old man about his wife, and it makes him reflect on, am I being Spider-Man? Me being Spider-Man is really holding me back from living my life with MJ and all these things. And it was such a great moment. Legitimately one of the best side quests I have ever played in any video game, period. And they did that a few times. But some of the side quests with Miles Morales, in terms of like with the school, I didn't enjoy as much. So I feel like, just in comparison to the other games on this list, I don't feel like it quite reaches there. Like I said, right outside the top 10 for me. So I'm going to go ahead and cross off Marvel Spider-Man 2. All right, so we have one more game to cross off this list. And just to recap, we have Dead Cells, Dark Souls, Final Fantasy 16, Xenoblade Chronicles 2, Horizon Forbidden West, and Hollow Knight. Now, I know a lot of people are going to be out there and they're going to say, oh, dude, Horizon Forbidden West just came out. Final Fantasy 16 just came out. How can it be on your top 10 of all time when it literally just came out, And I believe in a thing called recency bias. 100%. 100%. There have been several movies and several games that I played, and while I'm playing it, I think it's the best game of all time, right? But then once you sit back and kind of let the dust settle, you kind of realize that, okay, maybe that wasn't necessarily the best game of all time. It was just a great experience. So in order to cross off this final game of this list, we're going to go through and talk about each of these games. So Dead Cells, phenomenal game. It is one of the best, if not the best, roguelike game of all time. It is, to me, there was just so much replayability in this because you could go with different builds. And then on top of that, they added additional DLC and free DLC at that. And then there was a couple of paid DLC, and it just added to the overall game. And the reason why I feel like this could be a top 10 game of all time for me is, and the thing that would put it back into the top 10, because I feel like when I did my top 10, now I do remember Dead Cells kind of being in that 10 range, 11, 12, somewhere around there when I have tried to list my top 10 games of all time. And I'll say this, I have put in 100 plus hours into this game. 100 plus hours. I'm telling you, I fucking love Dead Cells. I think it is a perfect game. You could say 10 out of 10. I think it is a masterpiece of a roguelike. I legitimately have no issues with the game whatsoever. The thing that would push it over the edge for me is the Return to Castlevania DLC, which I think is legitimately one of the best DLCs ever. Absolutely loved the Castlevania DLC, and it added a different flavor to the game. And then it also gave you Dracula, which was a stupid hard boss at the very end. So the fact that you could get all the way to the end and then just get your ass just destroyed by Dracula was just fantastic in the best way possible. In the worst way, best way possible, I don't know. But it was amazing. Dead Cells, I feel like I can't cross that off the list. I feel like that has to be one of my top 10 games of all time. And then taking account the DLC, Return to Castlevania, I don't know. Like I'm saying, I'm not going to cross it off the list just yet. Then we have Dark Souls. This one's interesting. And I think a lot of people who have been following the channel for any length of time kind of knows how I feel about Dark Souls. Dark Souls was my first Dark Souls entry. I played it on the Switch, and I fucking fell in love with From Software and the Souls-like genre. I played Dark Souls 3, which, look, I love Dark Souls 3. I'm including it here, so I'm not having two different games. I mean, they're essentially the same game, guys. A little different mechanics, per se, and some different bosses, but it's same general idea. I'm just including them. I'm cheating, okay? I'm cheating. Dark Souls was one of my favorite games, if not my favorite game, for a long time, because I just loved the lore. I loved the combat and the difficulty of the game and the settings, just everything. Just the world design in Dark Souls 1 was just it's unmatched. It's unmatched, honestly. And yes, played Dark Souls 3. Didn't finish Dark Souls 2 because I'm not too crazy about that game. But then we have Elden Ring, just all these From Software games that are just absolutely fantastic. And Dark Souls was my first time going into that type of video game, that type of genre. So personally, I don't think I can cross it off the list. I think I have too many memories to this game and too much in stake in terms of what I love in video games nowadays to cross it off the list. And then next up, we have a relatively new game, came out last year, Final Fantasy 16. So here's the thing about Final Fantasy 16. Fucking loved the game. Is it my favorite Final Fantasy game? I don't know. The thing that really holds this game back for me is the linear aspect of it. I say that, and then Final Fantasy X is my favorite Final Fantasy game of all time, right? And that is pretty linear, but it gives you a whole lot of things to do on the outside. Now, the one thing that I'll say about Final Fantasy 16, and the thing about it is, it does feel like it's a very, very dense story, and it feels like they don't give you enough time to really expand and just love the characters. They do that really at the back end of the game, which is kind of disappointing. I wish they would have done that more so like throughout the entire game. So that would be like one of my biggest issues with 16 is they just backload all of the character development, all those character moments between these characters on the final 15 20 missions that it gets you right before you go and do the final chapter. The combat is great. I love mixing and matching all of the different abilities. And again, it has, if you were to sit here and say, if you're a, I don't know, 13, 14, 15-year-old boy, and you're sitting here and say, what can I do? What can I create to make some fucking badass moments? That is what Final Fantasy 16 is. It is like, and I don't mean this in a negative, it is like they tapped into their childhood and said, what would be fucking just awesome and just metal as fuck, dope. And they did that with Final Fantasy 16. With the score was so fucking good. So fucking good. So really, Final Fantasy 16 gives me some of my favorite moments in a video game, period. I really wish they would have done better with the characters and not backloading all that development. But those are just minor gripes. And again, when we're trying to talk about top 10 games of all time, those minor gripes really matter in whether I cross this one off my list or not. I'm going to leave it on there for now. Final Fantasy 16 is the one, I'm going to put a star next to it. It is the one game that's really just hanging on by a thread at this point because, and again, I'm not saying it's a bad game. I fucking love this game. But in comparison to some of these other games, I don't know. It's right there, guys. So this is a potential one that we could cross off the list, as painful as it is to say that. Next up, we have Xenoblade Chronicles 2, which was our first deep dive series for the 2 Game podcast. Now, you can't catch that on YouTube or anything like that. You have to go to Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to audio podcast at. Chris and I did a deep dive into Xenoblade Chronicles 2. We recapped the entire game, story beat for story beat, and then gave our thoughts and opinions on the entire game. Legitimately one of my favorite gaming experiences of all time. And the game was fucking amazing in and of itself. The combat was absolutely fantastic. Now, I think they improved I do think they improved the combat in Xenoblade Chronicles 3. It's just, we're not going to get into my thoughts on Xenoblade Chronicles 3 just yet. I haven't finished it. But Xenoblade Chronicles 2, the story was absolutely incredible. It gave you moments with each character. It gave you emotional moments at that. There were some moments I was like, oh, fuck, man, that just absolutely rips out your heart. Just some of the boss battles were great. It's just, to me, 100%, this has to go on my top 10, not crossing it off. And I highly recommend going to check out our deep dive into that, especially if you want to recap on Xenoblade Chronicles 2, if you want to play 3. We have a mega episode, which is, I think it was like 5 hours long. It's like all of the parts put together, but you can go find it. It's broken up into, I think, 5 different parts. The final 2 games that we want to talk about. And honestly, I think it's between Final Fantasy 16 and then these 2 games. I think Dead Cells is on the list. I think Dark Souls is on the list. Xenoblade Chronicles 2 is on the list. And really, if I'm just throwing it out there, Final Fantasy 16 is probably going to end up on the list. But we have Horizon Forbidden West and Hollow Knight. Horizon Forbidden West was a phenomenal game. You can make the case that the story for Zero Dawn was better, sure. But Forbidden West, the story was good. It was good. It's the combat and the missions, the side quest, the collecting all the collectibles, doing everything in that world is just one of my favorite experiences of all time. And there were some days where I would just spend an hour just fighting machines, not even accomplishing anything. And that was legitimately one of the best things about the game, was the fact that you could go in a straight line and then you could make a beeline for a destination and then on the way see hundreds of different things to do, and it would take you forever to get to your destination because I would just ADD and just go off and do other shit. So legitimately one of my favorite gaming experiences of all time. Is it a perfect game? No. I think the story gets kind of lost in the mud a little bit. Maybe not as good of a story as Zero Dawn, but Forbidden West, still a great story, still has some great character moments throughout the entire game. And the DLC was fucking great too. I don't remember hearing a lot of people talk about the DLC and about how amazing it was, but I absolutely fucking loved the DLC. It was great. So all of that in one package, it's a start. I don't know. I'm gonna leave it on the cusp. Let's talk about Hollow Knight for a second. The thing about Hollow Knight, and guys, look, I'm griping about small things at this point because it's the top 10. So Hollow Knight is one of my favorite games of all time, bar none. Like, let's not get this confused. Hollow Knight is one of my favorite Metroidvanias of all time. I mean, you can consider Dead Cells a Metroidvania roguelike for sure, but in terms of just pure Metroidvania, no roguelike aspects, this is number one to me. I think the score is great throughout. The game is phenomenal. Combat is great. Great bosses. Tough as shit bosses too. Like, the deeper you go down, the harder this game goes. Shout out to that. Like, when you get to the abyss and to those dark areas, the game it becomes a little tedious to me. And I do remember being aggravated several times with those specific regions. But the art style, the animations, some of the best animations and art style of all time. I would put this game up against any other game, and I would argue that it is one of the best, if not the best. I absolutely love the art style of this game. It is legitimately one of the best. So now trying to weed out one game between Final Fantasy 16, Horizon Forbidden West, and Hollow Knight, I think are the three games that are really up for contention to being taken off of this list. Pains me to say this. So I'm going to keep Final Fantasy 16 on the list for sure, because I think in terms of the gripes between this Forbidden West and Hollow Knight, I think I don't really have all that many gripes about 16. It was really just they backloaded the game with side quests and character development. So I think that's a very, very minor gripe. So that leads me to Forbidden West and Hollow Knight. My complaints for Forbidden West was the fact that I feel like the story is not as strong. Hollow Knight, I feel like the difficulty spikes in the later portions of the game. So really we're comparing apples to oranges here, not only just in terms of the style of games, the genre of games that we have, but also I can't really compare difficulty because they're vastly different. So I guess the question that's really going to separate these two games is whether or not I would go back and play this today. This is tough. Like, I feel like I'm shitting on this game if I cross it off this list. But I gotta narrow it down. It's a top 10 for a reason. I can't have a top 11. That makes no fucking sense. But man, this is a tough decision, guys. Horizon Forbidden West, Hollow Knight, and shit. I mean, you could even add in the fact that Hollow Knight, I mean, is there really a story to that? I mean, I don't even fucking remember the story. It was just the gameplay that really sold it on me. So comparing the stories, there's nothing that can separate them. Gameplay-wise, which would I rather do? I think Forbidden West definitely has the more expansive gameplay for sure, the most expansive combat. I do wish that they gave us underwater sequences, but you can't do shit underwater. Like, you can't go in there and have combat underwater, which I think was a huge mistake, which I'm hoping in Horizon 3 they will actually do. All right. So I think I made my decision. And I don't think I'm happy about it. And by all means, it could change when I do my top 10, okay? I'm putting that little caveat there, a little disclaimer. This could possibly change. I think if I think now that we have compared both of these games together, story-wise, the lack of one in Hollow Knight, Forbidden West, not all that strong. It's still good. It's still good, but it's not strong. The combat in Forbidden West is superior, but it's comparing apples to oranges because that's just not what Hollow Knight is. For the Metroidvania aspects of Hollow Knight, it absolutely fucking nails it across the board. Horizon Forbidden West, I think a lot of it can be considered busy work in terms of like the collectibles and the puzzles and stuff like that. But the combat is so damn good. So damn good. But I just never felt like I really got ever attached to any of the characters in Forbidden West. I'm going to give the edge to Hollow Knight. And the reason why I'm going to give the edge to Hollow Knight is when I put these games side by side, I'm probably more likely to go play Hollow Knight versus Horizon Forbidden West. And I say that because I feel like, one, it does have the benefit of me not having played Hollow Knight in a long time, whereas Horizon Forbidden West, I played that for a fucking solid like 7-8 months, and I just played it last year. So it does have that benefit. I will give it that. But I feel like I'm more likely to go play Hollow Knight right now versus Horizon Forbidden West. And you put these games next to each other. Which game will I think about in terms of best of all time? I love Horizon Forbidden West. The issue is I'm not so sure I would consider it one of the best games of all time. Hollow Knight, you can make the case that it is one of the best games of all time in terms of Metroidvanias, just because of the art style and all that. And I think that's the thing that separates it for me. And I think that's the reason why I'm going to include Hollow Knight in my top 10 and not Horizon Forbidden West. All right, so I'm going to share my screen one more time for y'all. So here are the 5 games that we have narrowed this shit down. So yes, these 5 games will end up on my top 10. Now, where they end up, I don't know. Dead Cells, Dark Souls, Final Fantasy 16, Xenoblade Chronicles 2, and Hollow Knight. I knew once I was trying to get down to the nitty gritty, it was going to be tough to cross out Forbidden West because I have been a Horizon Forbidden West dick rider since I beat that game. Shout out. But I just think when you put the 2 games right next to each other, Hollow Knight just has better things going for it and things can make it last longer in the video game space. And I feel like it'll have a longer lasting legacy. Whereas I think probably Forbidden West could be forgotten about in a few years, especially when 3 comes out. It could wash away everything that Forbidden West ever did. But the combat is really the thing that pushes it up so far on my list. I think Hollow Knight, and I can't even discredit it for the difficulty spikes. But yeah, Hollow Knight. Yeah, I gotta put that in there. Gotta cross off Forbidden West. So guys, you let me know down below what I got right, what I got wrong. Now, next week, I'll be doing my official top 10 games of all time requested by our Patreon. And guys, if you want to be a part of our Patreon and you want to be able to vote on things that we do every single month, every single week, then you need to go to patreon.com/2game. The link is down below in the description. Greatly appreciate it if you went there and subscribe to us and support us at our Patreon. Also down below, links to all of our social media accounts. Go there, like, subscribe, follow, do all that shit. Really helps us out, and we'd greatly appreciate it if you did that. But guys, that is going to be it for me, and I will catch y'all next week on my top 10 games of all time. Laters.